Today many churches are doing their best to draw people in, but this one behind me looks like it was designed to keep people out. We're here in Kells Priory in County Kilkenny. This isn't the Kells of the Book of Kells, that's Kells County Meath. This community is much younger. It was founded by Geoffrey Fitzrobert in the 1190s. Fitzrobert was a knight in the retinue of William Marshal, a hugely powerful Norman leader. And Marshal gave the lands around here to Fitzrobert as a reward for loyal service. Fitzrobert then did what all good Norman colonists did. He built a castle, he set up a little urban centre, and he founded a church with a religious community attached. Now, what kind of religious community would he opt for though? There was a menu of options. The Dominican and Franciscan and Augustinian and Carmelite friars, they would prove popular choices for patrons later on, but they weren't around yet. There were military orders like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, and there were monastic orders like the Benedictines and the Cistercians. The Cistercians were very much on trend at the time, but they were expensive. Their monasteries had to be built in just the right way, and their rules prevented them from moving into a monastery until it was more or less completely built. And the minimum number of monks in a community was 12, and that's quite a lot of monks to feed. But there was another kind of religious community that was a lot more flexible and cheaper. Augustinian canons. They were everywhere in the Middle Ages, and they're almost nowhere now. There's just a handful of communities of canons regular left in the world, but there were once dozens in Ireland alone. Their communities were made up of priests who lived according to the rule of St. Augustine and who celebrated Mass and ran the parish, providing the sacraments to the wider community. Unlike the Cistercians and later the Franciscans and Dominicans, they didn't really have an international structure of government and education, with lots of coming and going between houses. There were some relationships between houses, but each priory was more or less independent. And again, this meant that each community could be fairly flexible in what they did and how they did it, which could of course work for good or ill. So if they needed to remain fairly small, for example, that was possible. If they needed to run a load of different churches locally, that was possible too. There was no superior higher up to wrap them over the knuckles. To get a sense of how popular these canons became, consider this. By the end of the Middle Ages, more than half of the parishes in the Diocese of Ossory, this diocese, were being run, not always run well, by Augustinian canons. So when Geoffrey Fitzrobert opted to bring Augustinian canons to his new church in Kells, he was making a perfectly mainstream choice. He invited over 4 canons from Bodmin Priory in Cornwall to form the foundation of the community here. This priory wasn't fully built then, but that was fine with the canons. They moved in and building took place in piecemeal fashion. That was how this place was founded. But at its dissolution in 1540, it was, as you can see behind me, enormous. If you look around here, you'll see a huge assembly of buildings with massive walls and towers enclosing the land. Now, we might think this meant that the community of canons flourished in the intervening centuries and went from strength to strength, but that's not quite the case. It did certainly become very wealthy, but the 14th century was very challenging for them. There was a breakdown in social structures around here. The major magnates in this area, they began to rule their lands from England, and the absence of a firm hand locally here encouraged constant wars between various baronial families, all scrabbling for power. Add to that the fact that the Fitzrobert family died out, so the priory had no big secular protector. And then in the 15th century especially, the Gaelic Irish are increasingly confident and they raid the lands in this area. All this meant that the canons here were not happy campers. In 1421, the canons complained that because of local violence, their income is no longer sufficient to maintain all their churches. In 1446, the Prior of Kells co-signs a letter to the King of England to complain that the Earl of Desmond and his Gaelic allies have burned and wasted 76 towns and 16 churches in this area and robbed them of all their goods. And Kells was probably one of that number. It was around that time, the middle of the 15th century, that these huge defensive walls rose up. And they were almost certainly erected not only to protect the church and priory, but also to provide a place of retreat for dependents of the abbey and their goods at times of unrest. Now, all this might seem a worthy and noble purpose, but providing castellated defences isn't really the role of a religious community. It might be understandable if they were also maintaining their religious duties, but it seems they weren't. In 1471, a local man notes that divine worship here is neglected. Their very founding purpose, in other words, is being ignored. The community of canons is acting more like a conglomerate of landlords than a community focused on worship and pastoral care. They're stepping into the vacuum of local leadership here and acting like secular lords. They're even taxing their dependents with taxes that have nothing to do with the life of the church. The historian Adrian Empey, he notes the paradox of these buildings. They look like the sign of a renaissance here, but they're actually a sign of what he calls a continuous slide into the secular abyss. The canons of Kells had slowly become something they were never meant to be, and they lacked the internal resources to resist this drift towards secular lordship. In the case of the orders of friars, corruption and decline certainly existed, but there were also corresponding movements of reform, international movements, which renewed the orders again and again. But here in Kells, the canons were on their own. Progressively, like so many other houses of Augustinian canons, they opted for secular power and abandoned any attempts at spiritual leadership. Drifting in this direction was certainly understandable in the circumstances, but it's lamentable all the same, I think. While other orders from that time have survived into modernity, the canons drifted into oblivion.